Four, three, two, one, and I think we're live on Facebook. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to today's session. I'm Ishan, and today we have a very special guest, Dr. Swapna Liddle, ma'am, joining us, and she'll be speaking about the Delhi of Bahadur Shah Zafar, Twilight or Renaissance. Dr. Swapna Liddle's love for the city of Delhi, and in particularly Shahjahanabad, led her to write a PhD thesis on its cultural and intellectual life in the 19th century, and I think she did it under Dr. Narayani Gupta, and she has been closely involved in the movement to preserve heritage monument and its sites, and that she is also an inspiration to all of us at Karwan for the work she has done for Delhi. She is currently the convener of the Delhi chapter of the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage INTACH. She is the author of Delhi 14 Heritage Walks, Chandni Chowk, the Mughal city of New Delhi, and Connaught Place, and the making of New Delhi. And now I think she's working on another book that is going to be there in the market very soon. So, without further ado, I would like to ask Dr. Swapna Liddle to deliver today's Carwan special lecture. It is truly an honor to host you, ma'am, this evening. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Ishan and Karwan, for inviting me to this talk. And I, of course, I never need a second uh, invitation to talk about the city that I love. So always enjoy this. And I think what I'm going to talk about today is something that is particularly close to my heart because this is something that I have worked on for a long time. I spent 7 years actually doing my PhD on this period of Delhi's history. And yes, Narayani Gupta ma'am was definitely a great inspiration in that project. And my PhD supervisors, Professor Azizuddin Hussain and Mr. Mukul Keshavan were a great help. And this is the company period in Delhi's history. It is the end of the Mughals. My PhD thesis, of course, was on Akbar II and Bahadur Shah II, also known as Bahadur Shah Zafar. And so this is really a lecture which I is very close to my heart, the subject. The I think more specifically, I wanted to talk about one issue over here, which is the Delhi of Bahadur Shah Zafar. What is it? We there are a lot of cliches about it. We've heard a lot of things. There is a fair amount of work that has been done on this, particularly in the Urdu language. So there are books which have been written on it. Now works in English also have come out, and it's a little difficult to characterize this period because in the books that we read there are conflicting kind of images. One is that of the decline of the Mughals, because Bahadur Shah is the last of the Mughals. William Dalrymple's book was in fact titled The Last Mughal, though that is something that we know in retrospect. But so the last Mughal, the idea that this is the period of the last Mughal, very naturally lends itself to this characterization as a twilight of the Mughals. And in fact, an author like Percival Spear, for instance, spoke of this as this period of Delhi as the twilight of the Mughals. On the other hand, you have books, historians, writers have written about the cultural vibrancy of this period, because this period and Bahadur Shah Zafar's, by the way, Bahadur Shah Zafar's own, he comes to the throne in 1837, and it is all over in 1857 with the revolt that takes place. So it's a 20-year period that this specific talk is about. But really, the cultural efflorescence of this period, etc., is something that has been spoken about. And in fact, C.F. Andrews, who was, of course, a great Gandhian and a teacher as well, he characterized this as a sort of, he called this the Delhi Renaissance. So in the context of this very conflicting ideas of what this period really represents, a little bit of background as to what Delhi was at this time. And I think we have to really pick up the story a little bit further back from Bahadur Shah Zafar in 1803, when Delhi really comes under the rule of the East India Company. And how things came to that is also a slightly older story, because from the 18th century onwards, towards the second half of the 18th century particularly, there was a tussle over control over territories in North India, and the Marathas and the East India Company were major players in this particular conflict that was developing. And from the late 18th century onwards, it became almost inevitable that the East India Company, slowly expanding, would challenge the Maratha control. And Marathas, by the way, at that time even controlled the Mughal emperor, because it was the Scindias, Mahaji Scindia, and later Daulat Rao, who were the actual de facto rulers of Delhi, even though in uh, in nominal terms, it was the Mughal emperor at that time, Shah Alam II, who was ruling Delhi, but it was the Marathas who were actual rulers. And what the East India Company wanted was not only, of course, expanding to the north, gaining the territories of the parts of the Doab, but actually control over the Mughal emperor as well. And that was because the Mughal emperor held a even though for a long time the Mughal Empire had ceased to have any meaning, because the territories had increasingly been lost, all the erstwhile provinces had broken away, become independent, uh, and the Mughal Emperor had very little real power in terms of territorial possessions. But the symbolic value of the Mughal name was still so strong that, in fact, a lot of the successor states, as we call them, had also ruled in the name of the Mughal emperor. They struck their coinage in the name of the Mughal emperor. The East India Company itself used the emperor's name on its coinage. And such was the legitimacy of the Mughal emperor that everybody wanted not only to gain that legitimacy for their own right to rule, but to, if they managed, they understood that if they managed to control the Mughal emperor himself, that would give them incomparable power in that, in a particular sense. And that's what the East India Company did. It finally defeated the Marathas and gained Delhi and control over the city of Delhi and the Mughal emperor. So this had happened in 1803. And but there's a huge difference from the time of 1803 until when Bahadur Shah Zafar succeeded his father Akbar II in 1837. Because in this period, a sea change comes about. And that sea change is that in the initial period, when the East India Company had first gained control, it put up the Mughal emperor as a sort of a puppet, or at least as its symbolic face. And that face consisted of the consequences of using the Mughal emperor as a face were, first of all, they continued to, on their coinage all over India, all over their own territories, continued to mint their coinage in the name of the Mughal emperor. The Delhi mint, of course, continued. There was a mint in Delhi which minted coins as well. They had certain rituals of submission to the Mughal emperor. So, for instance, the Mughal emperor used to be presented nazar. Nazar is an offering. A nazar is an offering, but it's also very specifically from a subordinate to a superior person. So these nazars used to be given to the Mughal emperor on behalf of the governor general, and these were on ceremonial occasions, on Diwali and Eid, and there were some specific occasions, the Nowruz festival on the emperor's anniversary of the accession, these kind of festivals that the Nazar used to be given. I have also already mentioned coinage. The seal of the governor general. The governor general used to use a Persian seal when he corresponded with the Mughal emperor himself or for any other sovereign power in India. So when he was writing letters to, say, the Maratha chiefs or to Ranjit Singh or whatever, I mean, Ranjit Singh, of course, comes a little bit later, but whoever he corresponded with, for instance, he would use a seal in which he was described as Fidwi-e Khas, which means the the special devoted slave, or and he often addressed his letters when he wrote to the Mughal emperor as your devoted slave. Now that's interesting. He is putting himself very explicitly in a subordinate position to the Mughal emperor, and so this idea of the East India Company ruling on behalf of the Mughal emperor was maintained for a while, but as I said, things had changed from the time, and in fact, it had begun to change in the 1810s itself. And the reasons for these were that slowly the East India Company became more powerful vis-a-vis the other powers in North India specifically, and in other parts, in South India as well. And slowly what had happened was that it had uh, Tipu Sultan was taken care of, the Marathas were slowly taken care of. So with this, and particularly in North India, with the defeat of the Marathas, what it meant was that the East India Company could now come into its own. It did not have to use the mask, the mukhota of the Mughal emperor to hide behind. And slowly it discontinued some of these things. So the mint, for instance, in Delhi was discontinued. After a while, they decided to start talking about discontinuing the name of the Mughal emperor in their coinage as well. Then the nazars on behalf of the governor general were slowly withdrawn. The titles that the Mughal emperor used to give to the governor general and other people, those were discontinued. So slowly what had happened was that this idea that the Mughal emperor was the actual ruler had been given up. And definitely by the time we come to Bahadur Shah Zafar, this was not the case. Bahadur Shah Zafar was not even a puppet. So this is something that we need to really understand, because a lot of people have this idea, and I have seen this written also, that till 1857 it was the Mughals who were ruling. And no, they were not ruling, not even in Delhi. The power that the Mughal emperor really had was he had jurisdiction over the Red Fort. The Red Fort within the city of Shahjahanabad, which was the city of Delhi at that time, basically, uh, was inhabited by the extended Mughal royal family, their dependents, their retainers, their staff, etc. And it was over this area, the lives of these people, that the Mughal emperor actually had control. So his political control, his jurisdiction was really shrunk to his own extended family. That is the extent of the political or temporal power of the Mughal emperor. And in that sense, I would say that if you talk about a twilight of the Mughals, and particularly in hindsight, because we know that even this was in the long run a very 1857, of course, wiped it all out in one stroke, because the revolt happened, and after that, the Mughal line was completely evicted from the Red Fort. Bahadur Shah and some close family members were exiled, and that was it. It was the end of the Mughal throne in that sense. But even before that, really, they knew that this was not going to last, because the East India Company, the government in Calcutta, had made it very clear that after the death of Bahadur Shah, they would not recognize a successor as emperor. He would only be known, or even king, he would only be known as the head of the family of Temur, or whatever. That's actually the title that the Mughals themselves used to use. They didn't call themselves Mughals, they called themselves the family of Taimur. That was the ancestor that they um, uh, really symbolically looked up to in that sense. So, so the idea that the Mughal line was really, even in symbolic terms, the throne, the idea of the Mughal throne as the sovereign power in India, it was long gone, but the Mughals themselves would be now evicted from the Red Fort. In fact, that was also a part of the agreement that had been entered into with the successors of Bahadur Shah, that they would move from the Red Fort to Mehroli. So really, Twilight is not such a far-fetched idea from that point of view. On the other hand, this period of Delhi of company rule is also very exciting from a very different point of view, from the cultural point of view. And there are two aspects to this. One is the cultural and other influence of the Mughal emperor himself. And there, the period of Bahadur Shah Zafar is particularly strong. And you must realize that Bahadur Shah came to the throne in 1837 at the age of 61 years. And so when we talk about the period of Bahadur Shah, we are talking actually not only of the time that he's on the throne, but when he was heir apparent as well. Now, when he was heir apparent, it was a very peculiar situation, because actually we can say in a way that he came to the throne with the blessings of the East India Company, because actually his father did not want him as a successor. His father wanted a younger son of his, Jahangir, Mirza Jahangir, and then later Mirza Salim, when Jahangir died quite young. So he was not his father's choice as successor at all. And in fact, Bahadur Shah himself had repeatedly uh, undermined his father's authority because of this particular grievance vis-a-vis the East India Company. So he wrote many letters to the East India Company saying that my father is not capable of deciding. He's not fit. He's imbecile. He's senile, and you should not pay any attention to him. And I need to be the heir apparent. And the East India Company actually agreed with him, because they had a very different view of succession, because the British actually, in their own ethos, were used to the idea of primogeniture, that the first male uh, offspring inherits the throne, whereas the Mughals had never had this tradition. For them, it was not the first born at all. It could be anybody, and it could be any son at least. I mean, daughters were really not in the equation, but any son who was deemed fit, and particularly the choice of the father, could inherit. So in this way, Bahadur Shah was actually going against that particular tradition and using the East India Company to get to that. Of course, there is no doubt that in many ways Bahadur Shah, or actually his name was Zafar. That's before he takes the throne. It's not Bahadur Shah, but Abu Zafar is his name. And Zafar, so therefore he comes to the throne really having undermined his own father and taken the help of the East India Company. So he is in fact, a part of that the system that the East India Company have of and it's ironic that later he starts this tussle with the East India Company on his own behalf, once he becomes the ruler, because he wants a younger son to succeed him, and then that puts him in a bit of a conflict with the East India Company. But that is beside the point. What I was saying was that the Mughals are very, very much in decline. Nevertheless, there is in the city, this is a period of very, very interesting cultural developments, because one thing that the East India Company's conquest of Delhi and of this part of the Doab really did was that it put an end in time, particularly with the defeat of the Marathas in 1818, a long period of peace came about, just because the East India Company had really defeated its enemies for the most part, except Punjab happens a little later. But a large part of the Doab and the area around Delhi is now stable. And because of that stability, there comes a period of prosperity, rising agricultural produce, and uh, it's just that the disorders of the previous, of the late 18th century particularly, they come to an end. The elite of Delhi are actually made up in a large part of people who had traditional ties to the Mughal throne, but also a lot of newer entrants. So a lot of the nobility who spent a lot of the area which was immediately around Delhi, a lot of them, and they spent much of their time in Delhi, so they become important from the cultural. They participate in the cultural life. Many of these are actually creations of the British East India Company. When the British East India Company was fighting with the Marathas, these are the people who had given them military help, and therefore, once the war was over, they were given jagirdaris. They were given these princely estates, to independent estates, to for themselves. And so you have, like for instance, the princely, the state of Firozpur Jhirka and Loharu. Uh, that was given to Ahmad Bakhsh Khan. Then there is Dujana, another one of the states. Then there's Patodi, there is Jhajjar, then Bahadurgarh. These are all states that were creations of the British, in fact. These were creations of the British. Then there are others like Ballabgarh and Sartana of Begum Samru. These were pre-existing, but these were confirmed by the British. So a lot of the nobility resident in Delhi also owed its position to the Mughal, not to the Mughal so much, but the East India Company. These are the people who make up the elite of the city. There is also a cultural, intellectual class which has traditional roots in Delhi at this time. And one must realize that when one talks about the decline of the 18th century, the disorders of the 18th century, to a large extent, one of the fallouts had been that a lot of the poets, for instance, had migrated looking for other avenues of patronage. A lot of people had left the city. But even so, there was this substratum of an educational tradition, for instance, which sort of survived. And with the coming of peace, you have these people again building on those traditions. And educational institutions revived. Delhi had been long a center of education as well, as a Mughal capital as well. So all those things are there. There is a tradition of, say, poetry. There is the great poets of the 18th century, though they had, like Mir and Sauda, etc., though they had often, many of them had left the city eventually because it was so unsafe in some ways, and certainly there was no livelihood there. They constituted a part of this intellectual life of the city, and though they themselves left, but they had grown up in the milieu, and the milieu was still there. So it was this milieu that again sees a sort of it comes into a sort of a revival again once the East India Company comes in, and that peace particularly sets in. So and Zafar, even when he is not before he came to the throne, was a part of the people who used to patronize poets. And he's very much about, he himself used to, of course, write poetry. He was also, his Ustad Zauq was, who was a very well-known poet as well. So that is there. There are other poets also, but I will come to that later. What really is new in this is the presence of new institutions. One of them, for instance, is the Delhi College. The Delhi College had been established in 1825. It was the first Western-style college in Delhi. But here again, there are two things to be remembered. First of all, this is a very the idea of the East India Company was to ultimately spread a Western education in among the elite of India, and Delhi was seen as an important center of that. Uh, and to among the and this was an intellectual elite that they were looking at. They were only looking at higher education. They were not looking at primary education at all at this point. So the idea being that Western education, and hopefully people will who graduate from this will get government jobs and fulfill the bureaucracy, the lower levels of the bureaucracy of the company itself. So that was a major issue, the major aim of the East India Company in setting up the Delhi College. But the direction that the Delhi College took was slightly different, because the East India Company at that point got a big grant of money of 1,70,000, which is quite a large sum in those days, by Fazl Ali Khan. Fazl Ali Khan was the Prime Minister of Awadh at that time, and he belonged to Delhi. As I said, there was this intellectual elite of Delhi were quite tied up with the educational tradition, and he wanted to give this money the for traditional education in Delhi, for a Persian based. In those days, education meant education based on a study of Persian and Arabic. And that is what he wanted to give that money for. And therefore, the East India Company, who was always looking at how to get things done cheaply, gratefully accepted that money and put it towards the making of the Delhi College, as it came to be known in time. Now, because this money was used to such an extent, and therefore some gesture had to be made for it to be not so much a Western style college, but to have this very indigenous element to it. So the Oriental aspect of it, and therefore this college had some features which you don't see in other Western style colleges in India at that time, which were developing slowly, like the Agra College, which slowly also started from from a similar background at around the same time, but took a very different turn. Here, a lot of the teaching was in the local language, which was Urdu. So a lot of teaching was in Urdu. Languages were taught. English was also, there was an English section, which was English medium, but there was an Urdu medium section also, and then languages were taught. So this was a very interesting, the Delhi College became, in fact, a sort of a breeding ground for some very important figures in the cultural and intellectual life of North India in the long run. So one of them, for instance, some of the early ones are like Mohanlal Kashmiri, who was, as a young man, he was one of the first to join the English class when it started in the Delhi College, and he became a sort of a diplomat, because he in Afghanistan, Central Asia, he was Persian speaking, and the fact that he could speak Persian, the fact that he could also speak English, really helped in the the kind of role that these early people played, English educated people played, was in helping the East India Company's expansions into into the Northwest and other parts in Tibet and all, also in earlier periods. So this is the kind of person who is facilitating that growth of the East India Company itself, in fact, and they are in that sense fulfilling the mandate of the Delhi College. In fact, this kind of it had been going on for a long time, even before the establishment of the East India Company. And in fact, a lot of for instance, the Fort William College in Calcutta, which was set up to educate the English who were coming to rule India, that also was manned by some stars from Delhi. So Amman, who is seen as the author of Bago Bahar. So these are people who are also from Delhi. But to come back to that, So you have these kind of people. Now, from the 18, in the 1840s, there was a bit of reorganization, and that's when the Delhi College really takes off. And you have people like, one is Master Ramchandar. Ramchandar, who was a mathematician, he really he brought out certain magazines for the popularization of science in modern science. And some of these, one of them, of course, one of the journals was of the Delhi College itself, called Kirano Sadain. But then he brought out two on his own initiative. One was Fawaidun Nazareen, one was Muhibbe Hind. And the idea being to bring about not only scientific education, but progressive thinking, where he rather controversially sometimes questioned, for instance, religious texts for their faulty depiction of the natural world, and all those sort of things. And also discuss issues of social reform, like early marriages, widow remarriage. All these things were discussed in these newspapers. So the Delhi College becomes a place not only where students are being taught, but in Western science. And it slowly develops a good laboratory, a great library, and new uh, new technology is being taught, new ideas are coming in, but they are also being disseminated in a wider public through these journals and efforts of people like Master Ramchandar. So that starts a little bit of a ferment in Delhi society, which is not to say that Delhi society was generally backward. We must realize that a lot of times we have said that this is Mughal Delhi, it is conservative, it is backward looking. It wasn't. In fact, Delhi had always been one of a very cosmopolitan, outward looking place, like all many vibrant cities in fact are. And the advent of tastes, of new styles, new tastes, was very eagerly embraced. So even early on, there had been they had embraced things like uh, Western architectural styles. So a lot of Indians also, the British, of course, built Western style buildings in Delhi, but the neoclassical elements were being used by local people also. They were, in fact, Delhi was one of the few places which visitors sometimes noticed that the street signs, shop on the shops, the names of the shops and the names of the proprietors, etc., were written in the Roman script. So they were written in English, which was quite surprising for them because they didn't see this in other Indian towns. Then even things like English was slowly catching on, and not only in the Delhi College, for instance. So Bahadur Zafar, before became the emperor, one of his brothers, Salim, he employed the local doctor to give him English lessons in his free time. So there were people who were really very, very open to new things, and therefore this ferment, it was not something that was very unusual for Delhi. This was very much in the tradition of Delhi people. It didn't need the East India Company to open all these avenues, but some of these things did happen because of this openness. The other thing that had happened by Bahadur Shah Zafar by the time he came to the throne was the taking off of the printing process. And we had some of the earlier, the print revolution as such can be seen really from the 1820s, I think, in Delhi, and 1820s, 30s, it slowly really picks up. And one of the early things is, say, religious reformers. And among those, one can see people like Shah Abdul Aziz and his brothers. They were from a very well-known ulema family in Delhi, and they started printing tracts, and a lot of that religious literature starts to get printed uh, off the presses. The other thing that happens is the newspaper, the printed newspaper. Now, newspaper was not something that was new in Delhi. There were earlier newspapers, and they used to be handwritten papers. They were mostly not for a subscriber in this sense as we are familiar with these days, but mainly for the information, gathering information for people who were outside. So somebody who's sitting in Jaipur, maybe a rich sorry, a rich businessman or a ruler or somebody, he wants to know what is happening in Delhi, what is going on at the Mughal court, what is happening in the city, what is the business climate, what are the political changes that are likely to take place, and they want to know. So they will employ a news writer to write out this news and have it sent on a regular basis. So these kind of news writing and newspapers, the handwritten newspapers, were already there, the akhbarat. And this is from this tradition develops the new newspapers which proliferate in the 1830s. From the 1830s, there is a proliferation of newspapers, and not only Farsi newspapers. And by the way, the language issue also. The formal language till quite late was Farsi. So really till the 1830s, one of the other things that is happening in 1830 is Farsi slowly is getting replaced by Urdu. Farsi was a more was nobody's mother tongue in Delhi practically, but this was the official language. It had been the official language under the Mughals, and it was the official language in the East India Company at the lower rungs of the bureaucracy. So it had been the official language. In the 1830s, it gets replaced by Urdu as the official language of communication in the bureaucracy. Even before that, Urdu had largely begun to replace Farsi as the language of prose writing, increasingly more poetry writing. And there also the patronage, a lot of it came from the Mughal court itself, because Bahadur Shah, even as the heir apparent and then as the ruler, he encouraged his ustad, who was first Zauq and later, after the death of Zauq, very late actually, Ghalib becomes his ustad. He asked them to write in Urdu more. So Urdu was kind of catching on. And these newspapers, these printed newspapers, because they want to reach out to a wider audience, they are more and more, it's the Urdu newspapers that are popular. So the Delhi Urdu Akbar is the leader in this. And so this is also the period where the Urdu language as a medium of prose comes into its own. Poetry is an earlier process. It had already happened to quite some extent, but Urdu prose really comes into its element. And here again, there is a prose style that is developing, which is an easy, simple prose style, not very flowery language. It's easy to understand. So, and here again, the pioneers are the newspapermen. And in newspapermen, I am including people like Muhammad Bakar, who is a graduate of the Delhi College, and then he of course he held a government job for a while, but then he also became the editor of the Delhi Urdu Akhbar. And that so the newspapers are one way in which this new prose style is developing in Urdu. The other is Master Ramchandar. Not he did two things. One, he was very actively involved in a translation project, because it had been seen in the Delhi College that if you needed to teach Western science in Urdu, you first needed the books, and therefore a translation project was taken up. And Master Ramchandar had done quite a few of the translations himself. So there again, he was setting a trend in how to use Urdu really as an effective medium, and not as a literary medium, but in things like textbooks as well. And the newspapers that he brought out, again, the prose style that was used was a very unflowery, simple Urdu language, which was so these are new developments in the language which are being taken up. The interesting thing is that there's another thing that is happening. The Delhi College and the meeting point, because a lot of this is happening in continuation with the Delhi College. One of the other alumnus that we need to talk about is Karimuddin. Karimuddin was a young man who had come from Panipat, had come to Delhi to study, and this happens to many of us who came here first to the city to study. And he comes to Delhi and he studies here. He studies in the Delhi College as well, and then later sets up a press. And he decides to do a mushaira, and he does a mushaira which is a very different form of the mushaira, because he does mushairas used to be these little assemblies of poets. We are used these days to mushairas and kavi sammelans and stuff like that, but the old mushaira used to be a very small affair of a few elite poets, small gatherings where they used to discuss poetry, recite their first verses, get the criticism. It was a sort of a seminar mode, really. And what happens with Karimuddin is that he starts a new kind of mushaira, which is much more democratic, shall we say, because a lot of people, many more poets are invited. He tried this model. Unfortunately, it was a business model, because he wanted to have these mushairas, and the results, the poetry that was recited was printed out, and he thought that this would be a popular, it would be a popular, it would sell well. These pamphlets, these fortnightly pamphlets would sell well. And he was probably right, but because of some business difficulties, he had to wind this up. But so what I was saying is that a lot of these pioneering ideas within the world of poetry, within the world of prose writing, these are all developing in Delhi at this time. And some of these are really quite new from any standard, not only in Delhi. For instance, Karimuddin also wrote a book on women's education called Talimun Nisa. Now, women's education at that stage in the 1840s is a very new subject to discuss in this length, so in this detail. So these are pioneering efforts. But it is not just that it's the Delhi College which is responsible for all this. As I said, there is already a tradition of learning, of intellectual and cultural substratum that is already there, and many of these things are coming from there. And there are people outside the system who are making a lot of new contributions. And one of them is Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. He's not Sir Syed Ahmad Khan at that point. He's Syed Ahmad Khan, who is in the judicial service, Munsif. And one of the things, he was interested in a lot of things, a very talented man. He was interested in astronomy, for instance, and mathematics. He was also very interested in archaeological remains. And he wrote really one of the most comprehensive early books in Urdu on Delhi's monuments. It's called Asarus Sanadid. He does this, and he did not go to the Delhi College. So this is something that is cannot be credited to that, but it's just that he had just published his book Asarus Sanadid for the first time, when in Delhi, there are enough people who are taking an interest in these archaeological remains for there to be formed a Delhi Archaeological Society. And that's a very interesting development, because we all know of the Archaeological Survey of India, but I would say that the Delhi Archaeological Society is its true predecessor. And a lot of things that later, and I would say later, for instance, Cunningham took credit for a lot of things which were actually done in the Archaeological Society, for instance. And many of these contributions were from the Indian members of that society. So one of, for instance, Syed Ahmad Khan himself, he, for instance, made one of the papers he presented was about historic bricks. So he talks about how bricks, different sizes of bricks, can help us identify different periods of archaeological layers. And that's a profound statement at that time. And in fact, they acknowledge it, that this is a very profound and new things that is being thesis that is being put forward. So he made that contribution. The other member who was very active is Ziauddin Ahmad Khan. And Ziauddin Ahmad is the younger brother of the Nawab of Loharu, Aminuddin. And he lived in Delhi. and from a noble family. And uh, he was an active member of this. He was really the person who identified, on the basis of various texts and explorations in Delhi, the sites of where is Siri, where is Jahapana, all these identifications, which later really people like Stephen Carr and Cunningham, etc., confirm without acknowledging the contribution of Ziauddin Ahmad Khan at all. So I would say that it was through these institutions like the Delhi College, like the Archaeological Society, that you can see a huge, not I would say not a huge change. This is in continuation with that intellectual tradition in Delhi, that these developments are happening here. Now, I think the sad thing is, actually, before I come to that, let me just make the final point when I'm talking about poetry. And poetry, of course, as I said, that there is greater Urdu that is coming in. There is, this is really a period of the greats of Urdu poetry also. There is Momin, there is Zauq, there is, and particularly in Farsi, there is Sehbai, and there is Ghalib. And this is the era of great poets in Urdu. But there is also a slow, as I said, a changing of the mushaira uh, format. For instance, even the mushairas that were held in the Red Fort were increasingly very large assemblies. These were very large assemblies, and much more in tune with the kind of mushaira that we are used to now, as a larger format rather than these small assemblies that used to happen before. Not only that, Urdu poetry itself is getting more democratic. There are many more people who were writing Urdu poetry. So if you look at the lists of poets, there are more and more people who are writing. Poetry is getting disseminated in a larger, and it's being made possible by the means of the print revolution. So poetry was appearing in the newspapers, for instance. A lot of the newspapers, not only the Delhi Urdu Akbar, but even the kind of publication that came out from the Delhi College, the Kirano Sadain, used to carry a lot of poetry. So it was spreading. And in fact, as I said, a greater democratization, a greater dissemination. A lot of people were then having access to so much poetry which they could read and understand, went on to write themselves also. But also at this time, there is, as I said, not in prose, but also in poetry, some sort of discussion of analyzing poetry, its critical analysis in modern terms. And a lot of that is also associated with the Delhi College, which is happening. And this later becomes really a new movement, which is taken to places like Lahore after the revolt of 1857. So really trying to wind up some of this, what is, after having spoken of all this, and this is what really C.F. Andrews hinted at when he talked about a Delhi Renaissance. And these are developments that are happening. I mean, they are in the context of the coming of the East India Company, but they are not entirely attributable to them. They are the direction they take is probably because of that, but that is already there in Delhi. The roots of it's based on the Delhi people and their abilities. What happens is that a lot of these institutions, like the Delhi College, the particular Western education in Indian language, that model, the Delhi Archaeological Society, all these kind of things come to a very abrupt end in 1857 because of the revolt. And of course, I haven't talked about the revolt because that is not the subject of this talk, but the revolt of 1857 and its aftermath, because the Mughal court was finished, Delhi was punished. Delhi was punished very badly for having participated in the revolt. Many of the people of Delhi were exiled, and many of them left forever. And many, of course, also died. One must realize that. And that really brings an end, an abrupt end to this period of intellectual ferment. And it puts a permanent end to the Delhi College model of higher education. It puts an end to the Delhi Archaeological Society, though Cunningham, who was a member of that society, then later goes on to found the Archaeological Survey of India. So that therefore, because 1857 abruptly puts an end to these things, I think they have been forgotten. And we have forgotten that what Delhi was. So therefore, there are these very nebulous ideas of a sort of old decaying Mughal empire, which was slowly limping to its end and is finally extinguished in 1857. And if there was any cultural element to it, it all consists of Momin and Ghalib and all that, who are brilliant, of course, and wrote brilliant poetry, but that also is towards it's on its last legs. There's nothing new that is coming out of this place. It's all, and therefore, and a lot because of 1857, a lot of what was subsequently written about this period is also in terms of a nostalgia of a lost world. So that Renaissance aspect, I mean, of course, I'm using C.F. Andrews' words. I may not use that term myself, but the idea that there is this exciting things happening in Delhi at that time, much of that is really lost to us. We have not remembered it, and therefore it is good to go back and look in some detail as to how a society like this changes, and what is the role of colonial rule, how exactly it works, and what are the interactions between different forces in this kind of intellectual change, cultural change that happens. So I think, wrap up over here, but I'll be very happy if there are questions to try and answer some of them.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this wonderful lecture. And we covered almost all the aspects of the city, from the nobility to the arts and culture, and then the Delhi Archaeological Society. We do have some questions, and I think Bushra Alvi Razak Sahiba had a comment that Khal Khuda ka Mulk Badshah ka Hukum Company Bahadur ka. That was comment, and then Paul Abraham asked that is there any publication that covers the lives of the nobility during this time?
uh, I don't, I would not say in that sense. I mean, you can glean certain things, you know, lives of the nobility. I there were books written on the Mughal court, of course, but I would say no, not really. We have uh, that there are for instance, there is fiction. Shamsur Rahman Farooqi's Kai Chand The Sare Asman is a fictional work based on this period of Delhi, which is a very interesting read because it does tell you. Fiction, I would say, fiction in this case, fiction is sorry, fiction is very useful, and I would definitely recommend, if you're interested, to read Shamsur Rahman Farooqi's book, because it is based on Delhi of that period. So yeah,
Yes.
that is what comes to mind immediately.
And hopefully we'll get to read some part of it in your book as well on
Yeah.
nobility.
Yeah. So I'm hoping, yeah, that will come up.
The next question from Paul Abraham is how did this noble class manage to balance allegiances, or were they clearly aligned to the emerging dispensation that is the British?
That's a very interesting question, actually, because politically speaking, as far as their politics are concerned, their loyalties are concerned, their bread and butter is tied up with the East India Company. So there's no doubt about that. But there are ties of the Mughals had developed a sort of a culture of uh, allegiance. So it's very interesting that the British relationship with a lot of these people is of a very impersonal type. So what happens is you can, and there is a very interesting document with the National Archives, which is the court diary of the Mughal emperors. So and I'm not talking only about the nobility, I'm talking about the others also. So for instance, when Holi comes around, there are people who are bringing presents. So they take it to the resident. For instance, Charles Metcalfe, this is the early part of the 19th century. And from Ranjit Singh, a gift comes for Holi for the resident. And the resident returns it. Said, okay, Holi is not our festival and we don't celebrate it. Therefore, we will not accept any gifts. So please take it back. The Mughal emperors, on the other hand, would gratefully accept them, would give gifts in return. There would be, so through these celebrations, and the Mughal emperor used to always hold darbars on these occasions. So whether it is Dashera or there is Diwali or there is Holi or there is Eid, Nowruz, the darbar is being held, people are coming in. Raksha Bandhan, there used to be one particular Kedarnath, Raja Kedarnath. His ancestor, in fact, he had been an adopted sister of Shah Alam II, of his grandfather. So there was that tradition which used to last for generations, that unke bete, his or their grandchildren will also come and tie that rakhi to the emperor, because this is a thing that is coming down from 3 generations. And this we see continues till 1857. These long hereditary ties to the Mughal emperor. And that is really why in 1857, once the revolt breaks out, everybody heads to Delhi. Everybody looks to the Mughal emperor to provide that leadership and become the face of the revolt. Because these ties persist. I mean, I've given just 1 or 2 examples. There are many, many of these kind, which I've, of course, discussed and I will discuss in the book also.
The next question is rather very interesting that Sagnik Sarkar asks that what was the influence of Raja Ram Mohan Roy's lobbying in London on behalf of Akbar II on company's policy toward the Mughal court?
Unfortunately, he did not get a lot of success, because even before he went there, the East India Company's government in Delhi had discredited his thing. They said, we will not recognize him as an ambassador of the Mughal emperor. We will not recognize his title of Raja. So therefore, they refused to really give him any credibility. And therefore, his acceptance in England also was not great. So from that point of view, his mission was a failure. And what is interesting, I mean, this is an aside, not really, it's related to that, and you might be interested in this, that Bahadur Shah Zafar, in fact, corresponded with Raja Ram Mohan Roy, and he was very angry for him with Raja Ram Mohan Roy, because Raja Ram Mohan Roy, one of the things he was pushing for is to get another son of Akbar II instated as the heir apparent, because that's what Akbar II had wanted. But Bahadur Shah Zafar himself sent an embassy also to England. And this time he picked an Englishman, somebody called George Thompson, who was actually an anti-slavery activist in Britain, and he chose George Thompson to head his embassy. But of course, George Thompson had slightly, I mean, he at least made a presentation before the directors of the East India Company, etc. But he also did not really get any success, because it was not a question of whether or not you're putting your case properly. The British were not interested in listening to the Mughal emperor or to giving him any importance at all. They had already made up their minds what they wanted to do with him.
Yeah, so the next question is from L.A. Mahfouz, and his question is, how far Britishers' irrelevant interference in the Mughal family politics responsible for their downfall, the Mughal downfall?
Uh, the Mughals, there were historical forces which meant that the Mughal as a political force, were slowly getting exhausted. So that was definitely there. And because the British were politically powerful, and because they controlled the Mughal emperor, after all, the Mughal emperor was also dependent on the British for things like his very subsistence. They gave him an allowance. And as long as his political importance was seen to be significant as a puppet or as a face of the administration, they paid some attention to him. But once they felt that, his even his symbolic importance was less and less, they paid less attention to him. And because of that, what happened was that other members of the family would often use the British influence to try and settle their own scores. So, as I said, Zafar himself used, the East India Company against his father and said, "I should be made ruler." And so therefore, so he is also cooperating. It's human nature. You cooperate with the power that can ensure your continued existence. I mean, that's it's as simple as that. So that is what happens.
Yeah, so the next question is again from Sagnik, and his question is: do we find Shia influence in poetry in Delhi in the 19th century, especially the culture of Marsiya, as in Awadh with likes of Mir Anis?
The Marsiya is there are the Marsiya go in Delhi also, but I don't think they are of the same caliber as the Lucknow. There, in fact, some of important members of the Mughal royal family themselves were Shia. But again, for instance, Akbar II's brother Suleiman Shikoh, but he also was resident in Lucknow for most part. So therefore, the Shia influence is much more in Lucknow, not so much in Delhi, really.
The next question from G. Krishnan, and his question is: what was the relationship of Bahadur Shah Zafar and his court with the dargahs of Hazrat Nizamuddin Auli and Amir Khusro, still vibrating with poetry, especially as Zafar was finally apprehended by the British opposite the dargah in Humayun's tomb?
Uh, the Mughals used to extend their patronage to a lot of dargahs, and there the previous question about the Shia comes into play also, because it's not only Nizamuddin, but it's also the dargah of Shah Marna, which is in Jorbagh. So that was also patronized. But I think their greatest patronage actually went to the dargah of Kutubuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki in Mehroli. That's where a lot of their patronage really went. So yes, they were patrons. The Phool Walon Ki Sair developed during Akbar II's time, the festival of communal harmony, which even exists today. So, and that was carried on by Bahadur Shah Zafar also. So yes, they did patronize a wide range of uh, and that used to come. It was not only the dargahs, but various fakirs and all who used to come to them. They used to patronize them also. The reason why he was actually captured from in front of Nizamuddin, I mean, as you say, close to Nizamuddin Dargah, is actually because he had gone to Humayun's tomb. And Humayun's tomb had a very different significance for them, because it was their family burial ground, really. A lot of the later Mughals also, their family members, not the emperors themselves, but a lot of the family members continued to be buried in in Humayun's tomb, even till the time of Bahadur Shah Zafar. So this was their space, shall we say. So that is why he's captured from there, because that's where he had gone.
Yeah, so we'll take two last questions before we end this session. And this is a question from Sanjukta Ghosh, and her question is: uh, it is true that we remember Bengal Renaissance more than Delhi's. Do you think Lal Killa ka Aakhri Mushaira symbolizes an intricate connection between political decline and cultural, even though your account shows how court culture and patronage was not only central? Print culture and Delhi College were important too, for example.
Uh, yes, the Lal Kile Ka Aakhri Busha, that book, which is actually based on Delhi Ki Aakhri Shama, Faratullah Beg's book, that yes, it's a fictional account, though the dramatis personae are actual people. It it is really the kind of romantic writing that came up after the revolt. It's of a later period, and it's an attempt to recapture the best moments of what used to be the last years of the Mughal court. So in that sense, it is very, it is romanticized. As I said, a lot of the writing that came up after the revolt really looks at Delhi of that period in those traditional terms, that it's a traditional world. There you will not see these new things happening, the newspapers and all that does not uh, figure in a lot of that reminiscing that happens about the period before. So yes, you're right. I mean, there is much less that is said about all those things, and in fact, that's what's the reason which prompted me to do a PhD on this subject, because I felt that these are aspects that are equally important, which have not been touched upon, and we must touch upon them.
We have the last question for the evening from Mishti Verma, and her question is: were Zafar and other such rulers ever called upon to weigh in on the matters of the hire of Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi as fellow royals? If so, did their support matter, or was it all immaterial because of the East India Company?
Yeah, they were never involved in any political deliberations like this. Uh, and certainly by the time we come to Bahadur Shah Zafar's period, the interactions between d- different royals, at least with the Mughal court, are minimal. One interesting thing happens that in the family of Bhopal, the Bhopal royal family, one of the princesses, there's the idea that she has to get married and who she will marry, and one of the candidates is one of the Shahzadas of Delhi. And this lady herself is quite impressed by this man because she's seen him, and he's charming and dashing and everything. And her mother and grandmother promptly shut it all down and say, "Nahi, they are, so they are starving. How could you marry them? They are in such poor condition." The Delhi royal family is really not somebody you should enter into any matrimonial alliances. It's so that is that. So really, there is, I don't see any. On the other hand, as I said, among the people of, if you look at the common soldiery who are in the East India Company, etc., they immediately come. Their instinct is to come to Delhi because that name ultimately is there. So that begins to happen after very soon, and then of course it's the princely states also, some of them rally behind the Mughal emperor.
I think, ma'am, if you allow, we have one last question
Yeah.
from Tara Dar Hassan. And her question is: around when did the thinking towards developing a new Delhi start among the Brit rulers?
Really, only in 1911. Uh, as far as the New Delhi plan is, that I presume you mean the transfer of capital, etc. That begins only in 1911. Before that, they had tried to draw on some of the symbolism of the old Mughals in the darbars they had. There were three coronation darbars. In 1877, you have the coronation, the darbar announcing the assumption of Queen Victoria of the title of Empress of India, Kaisar-e-Hind, and then her successor Edward, and then King George. And so that those darbars had taken place in Delhi, and there a lot of the symbolism was about drawing on the legacy of the Mughals as rulers of India. So therefore Delhi, even though they ruled from Calcutta, the British ruled from Calcutta. But 1911 is definitely trying to draw on the aura of the Delhi as a seat of empires in a very changed political climate in British India, where the national movement is really getting out of hand as far as the British are concerned, and they want to reproject themselves, rebrand themselves, as you would say in today's parlance, and project themselves as successors to successive Indian empires. So that is a very, very different context in which that happens. But between the passing of the Mughal throne and this new development. There's a huge period where Delhi really becomes a sort of a backwater for the British. They literally they annex it to, they amalgamate it with Punjab province. Even the Delhi College, for instance, shut down. There was no college in Delhi for a long time. It was all moved to Lahore, and Lahore really takes off as an educational center at this point, because a lot of the people who would originally would have first gone to the Delhi College now are now going to Lahore. And a lot of the diaspora of Delhi actually is spreading out to these new places, and creating an intellectual ferment over there. So Lahore's development as a center for the new critical movements in poetry, etc., is really a continuation of things that had begun in Delhi but were come to a sharp, abrupt end in 1857. So it's actually a very, very interesting study, and in some ways, one thing leads to another. Except the thing is that we, as historians, when we are studying things, we put artificial ends to, so my thesis ended with 1857, though, of course, it's not that everything comes to an end.
Yes. Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking out time to deliver this lecture and for clarifying so many questions. It was truly an honor to host you, and we look forward to having you again on Caravans one day.
Thank you so much. And it was a great pleasure to speak. And I understand that these will be recorded and put up also, right? The recording will be put up on Facebook as well.
So
So,
we will be posting the video on our YouTube channel, so those who are watching can go back and watch it again anytime, and
yeah.
it will be on Facebook as well. So thank you
And if
so much, ma'am, and thank you so much, everybody,
thank
yeah,
you.
who joined us live. So there are a couple of announcements for everybody. We have our next session on 9th of February. That is a film screening by Binoy K. Behl on the sacred Buddhist dance. That is a charm dance of Ladakh. Don't forget to watch it. And we have another interesting session coming up, another interesting initiative rather coming up. That is the Caravan Book Club that we are starting. And the first session of that is on 27th. The link to join Caravan Book Club is in the description of this video on Facebook and on YouTube. Please fill the forms. The first speaker for our session is Professor Romila Thapar, who is going to speak about her new book, Voices of Dissent. Thank you so much and have a great evening.